International news now.
So last Thursday, after meeting with executives from the steel and aluminum industries, President Trump announced his intention to impose tariffs of 25% on imported steel and tariffs of 10% on imported aluminum. He and his advisors have defended this policy as an effort to save the domestic steel and aluminum industries in the United States. Now, these tariffs would increase the price of imported steel and aluminum into the United States, which would help to make domestic producers of these raw materials more competitive in American markets. Together, the steel and aluminum industries employ about 160,000 workers, plus or minus 5,000 there, across the United States. Now, this proposal has generated a bit of an uproar within the Republican Party and with traditional American allies like Canada, the United Kingdom, and other members of the European Union. Since the end of World War II, the Republican Party has supported free trade, or the removal, not addition, the removal of trade barriers like tariffs as a device to heighten the competitiveness of domestic markets inside the United States. Free trade is consistent with traditional Republican views opposing government intervention into markets. Consequently, this policy has put President Trump at odds with much of his party. House Majority Leader Paul Ryan issued a statement on yesterday, asking the president not to advance this policy. Ryan worries that it will spark a larger trade war in which America's primary trading partners retaliate by raising their own tariffs, which would then make it harder for American businesses to export their products into other countries. Now, the European Union responded to Trump's announcement from last Thursday by threatening to impose tariffs on the imports of bourbon, Harley-Davidsons, and Levi jeans. Analysts also expect new tariffs on orange juice and other agricultural products. We will talk about why those industries are politically important in a bit. Now, Canada is likely to be hit hardest by these tariffs. In 2017, the United States imported about 27 million metric tons of steel from abroad. Canada was the largest source of these sales. The U.S. imported about 4.3 million metric tons of steel from Canada, or 16% of the U.S.'s total steel imports. Now, these steel sales are even more important to Canada. 90% of Canada's steel exports go to the United States. When we talk about aluminum, the United States imported about 6.3 million tons of aluminum last year, and over 40% of those imports came from Canada. The Canadian government has called these tariffs completely unacceptable and also plans to retaliate against them. We're going to cover this story in 5 parts today. First, we're going to describe tariffs, summarize what they are, and work through a basic tariff analysis. Second, we're going to talk more about the economic consequences of these specific tariffs on steel and aluminum inside the United States. Third, we're going to talk about the potential international consequences of this policy. Will it provoke a trade war? What does a trade war look like? Then we want to talk some about the national security implications of this trade policy. We're going to read through a statement or a letter from Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis to the Commerce Secretary that was released about 2 weeks ago about these potential tariffs. And fifth, we're going to review some of the domestic political consequences of this announcement. How are congressional Republicans responding, and will they reassert Congress's constitutional authority to set tariffs? All right, so now we want to do basic tariff analysis here. And the first thing that's important to point out is that tariffs act as a tax on foreign producers, but the consumers pay this tax. So this tax is imposed on foreign producers when that good crosses into the United States. This tax, though, is not imposed on domestic producers of the same goods. And so what the tariff does is separate the prices, and in this case, steel. It separates the price of steel that's produced by an American manufacturer of steel, and it makes the price of, say, steel made by a Canadian manufacturer more expensive in the American market. All right, so we can illustrate these consequences of tariffs we're going to go to an interactive figure right now. And this is actually an example from the t-shirt market, a hypothetical t-shirt market that you're going to see again when we talk about trade policy after spring break. But what this supply and demand chart is, so there is the blue line here, this is the domestic demand right here for, we can think about this as steel in this case, or it's t-shirts in this specific example. The pink line is domestic supply. And then the orange line is total world supply of the good in question. And note that it's much larger than that. And so in this initial situation here, we're going to treat tariffs as equal to 0. And so the difference, if you look in the upper right-hand portion of this, right, we can measure the quantity of imports in this situation by looking at the difference between DD, right, where I'm touching here in the lower right, and then the domestic supply of the good right here. And so this line right across here tells us our quantity of imports. Now, what happens when we raise the tariff? What we're going to see here is when we raise the tariff, it pushes the price up of the good in question, and it simultaneously shrinks the quantity of imports, right? So again, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, we can watch how, as we slide upward here, look at the import total now, it's about 48, and as I push it upwards, the prices go upwards, those total imports slide downward until they get to 0. And in this case, the tariff is so high that it cuts off all imports into the American market. And so the point here is, what do tariffs do? As tariffs increase in price, they cut imports and they raise the price of that consumers will pay for the good inside of the United States. So 3 takeaway points, right, from this basic tariff analysis. Tariffs raise domestic prices, they cut imports, and domestic producers are going to be more competitive in the domestic market because their prices have increased. They sell more products to the domestic market. Their profits go up and they can pay their workers more. Most importantly, this growth of consumer prices and higher revenues that's created by domestic producers generally acts to redistribute wealth inside the country. Consumers pay more, the government gets some tariff revenue, and domestic producers get to sell more of their goods at a higher price. They win big. Again, tariffs redistribute wealth inside the domestic economy.
Okay. Now we want to return to the specifics of the tariffs proposed by President Trump last week. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to run a video from the PBS NewsHour from last week to get an overview of the potential economic consequences of this proposed tariff policy. So let's go ahead and run that clip now.
President Trump promised during the campaign to get tougher on trade, and today he took a major step by announcing new tariffs on imported steel and aluminum. It has led some experts to warn of the possibility of a much bigger trade war. But at a meeting with industry leaders, Mr. Trump said the U.S. needs to crack down on countries flooding American markets with cheap metals, and he told the business leaders that the move would give them a big boost.
Pretty much all of you will immediately be expanding if we give you that level playing field, if we give you that help. And you're going to hire more workers, and your workers are going to be very happy. They're going to be very, very happy. And again, what's been allowed to go on for decades is disgraceful. It's disgraceful.
Mr. Trump said he would announce which countries would be targeted next week. There would be 25% tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminum. A number of Republican allies, including the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, took issue with the president's decision. The president has repeatedly threatened to take tougher measures against China, and the Wall Street Journal's Greg Ip is here now to explain what all of this might mean. Greg, thank you for being with us. Before we get into the reaction to all this, including in the markets, what would tariffs at this level, 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum, generally what would that mean?
Well, for companies in the United States that make steel and aluminum, it's great news. Those companies like Nucor or U.S. Steel or Alcoa will have higher profit margins because they can sell their steel and their aluminum at higher prices. It's good news for their workers. Those industries have lost a lot of workers because of import penetration over the last 15 years. Fewer jobs will be lost. Maybe a few jobs will get added. It's good news for some parts of the country where those mills are located. It's bad news, though, for any company that uses steel and aluminum. That's a lot of companies, way more companies and workers than actually produce it. Automobiles, for example, aerospace, the companies that make soda because of the soda cans, tin foil, all the consumers, you and I will all pay a tiny little bit more maybe too little to notice, but yes, we will pay more for those products.
And I was going to say we actually have some graphics showing some of that, and maybe we can show that to the audience while we're talking. But in essence, so the president sees winners in this country, but there are others who are worried that the reaction from abroad is going to lead to harm for other parts of the American economy.
Well, absolutely, and we've seen this movie before. In 2002, President George W. Bush raised steel tariffs partly to protect workers in West Virginia. And the analysis of that decision later showed that it actually hurt the U.S. economy because it raised costs so much in industries that use steel. Right now, people are worried not just about the immediate impact on the U.S. industry, but what if all these other countries that feel that we've treated them unfairly retaliate? So not only are those effects hurting us in terms of our consumption of those products, but our ability to sell to those other foreign markets is affected.
So how much does that explain what happened in the financial markets today?
So I think the negative impact on the stock market reflects a couple of things. First of all, tiny bit of harm to U.S. growth, a little bit of upward pressure on inflation at a time when the Federal Reserve is already talking about raising interest rates some more. Secondly, though, I think it also speaks to the overall degree of uncertainty and concern about this administration. You know, for the first year of Trump's presidency, it was all about less regulation and less taxes. Business loved that. Now they're seeing the less positive side of it, more protectionism. At the same time, enormous conflict both within the White House, within Trump's own advisors, and between the administration and its allies in business and the Republican Congress.
And we were told that there was serious disagreement inside the White House, as you're just suggesting over this. And there was also confusion about whether this was going to be announced today. We were told at one point it was not, and then the president announced it a few minutes later.
Right, and as you were saying, I think that some of the details have yet to be heard. We don't know specifically which countries are going to be hit with tariffs, how long they'll last, and it may be that there are other, attenuating factors that will come into play. So this all creates a lot of uncertainty around the decision.
All of which we will wait to see. Greg Ip, thank you very much.
All right, thanks for having me.
All right, so let me make a few points here. First, note who was present when Trump made this announcement. Aluminum and steel executives. This is important because they are the chief beneficiaries economically from this initiative. So of course they're going to love it, and they're all going to nod, and they're all going to wear their red ties, and everybody's going to match, and it's a party for them. And it's true that they will benefit the way that President Trump describes it. Their profit margins will increase. They will be able to expand their business operations. They will be able to hire more workers or take more profits, depending on how they decide to do that. And they could potentially pay their workers more. And so it shouldn't be really too controversial that this move on tariffs will benefit the aluminum and steel industries, right? Who within the aluminum and steel industries it will actually benefit is a bit more complicated, depending on what the executives decide to do with the rising profit margins that they will receive from this potential move. Now, second, consumers of steel and aluminum are clearly going to be hurt by these tariffs. Their costs are going to go up, right? So if the tariffs raise the cost of imported steel, then those who need that imported steel, automobile manufacturers, aerospace, soda cans and beer makers who use aluminum for their containers, they all will pay that cost, right? And so the consumers are hurt by this because those producers of automobiles, airliners, beer and soda, et cetera, will pass on those costs to the consumer.
So let me just give you a sample of all the industry groups that have protested these planned in the last 5 days. So auto manufacturers have issued a statement opposing them. U.S. car dealers have issued a statement opposing them. Boat manufacturers, the beer industry, retailers, machinery manufacturers like Caterpillar, and U.S. business groups more generally. So huge chunks of the industry groups in the American economy are opposed to these policies.
Right, and they're opposed to these policies because their profit margins will go down. Now, there is a debate to be had about the effect of these rising costs. So on one side, as you'll see in the next clip, some will say, well, the added cost will be so small that consumers won't flinch, right?
Absorb, yeah.
They'll just absorb it, and everything will be fine. Plus, we'll protect these vital industries and the workers of those vital industries, and so we'll do fine. The alternative to that is that no, this in the aggregate especially will be billions of dollars of added taxes on the American consumers, which will slow down economic growth generally and hurt these specific industries that consume steel. And so that's where the real debate lies, is trying to forecast the future and what's going to happen. The thing to note here is that when it comes to jobs, there are a lot more jobs in steel consuming industries like the auto industry, aerospace, et cetera, than there are in the steel manufacturing industry, which only has 163,000 jobs in the aggregate.
That's aluminum and steel.
Yeah,
so
and steel.
Steel's about 110 and aluminum's about 55 or 53.
But there was an estimate, I think, of like 6.5 million jobs in just a few of the main.
So the automobile industry is 7 million jobs.
Right. So just in the automobile. So if there's even a small impact on the auto industry that would cause them to cut their costs, it could cost more jobs, some argue, than any amount of jobs that would be boosted in the much smaller steel and aluminum manufacturing industries. Okay, so third, these costs of the tariff, right, are direct, but they also could be compounded by retaliation from other countries. And so that's the other big concern, especially among some of the Republican Party opposition to these tariffs. If the United States raises tariffs on steel and aluminum, our trading partners are already promising to raise tariffs on other products like American agriculture, and then these American exports in those industries that are targeted could go down. And this could then hurt the American economy overall, but also hurt the coveted jobs that we're trying to increase and help. And so in 2002, the United States, in the Bush administration, imposed a steel tariff. And when they did, it didn't last very long. They kind of pulled it back, but at the foreign retaliation helped to eliminate American jobs in their targeted industries, and the net outcome from a lot of experts was that the United States lost jobs, didn't gain jobs by this tariff. So the larger point here is that these tariffs will redistribute income inside the United States. Some groups win. We saw the groups that are going to win sitting next to President Trump. They do have hundreds of, a couple 100,000 workers. They will benefit as well. Nucor Steel has a plant in Norfolk, Nebraska, where I grew up, and so I knew a guy who
should have brought your family home there.
That's right. No,
your retirement
one of my
home there
best friends, his father worked for Nucor Steel, right? I mean, so those groups win, but then some groups lose.
Most groups lose.
Right, and consumers, which is everybody, loses a little bit, but then there will be other targeted groups and their workers that lose more because of this move, right? Those industries that consume steel potentially lose a lot. Okay, now we want to watch a second video that discusses the economic consequences of these tariffs a bit more. And it's an interview conducted last Sunday by Chris Wallace of Fox News with Peter Navarro. Now, Peter Navarro is the Director of Trade and Industrial Policy and the Director of the White House National Trade Council. These titles mean that he is one of the president's most prominent advisors on trade policy, and he had a huge influence on this move. This interview gets a little heated at times. That's why it's fun to watch, and we put it on there. And we're going to discuss it in 2 rounds. In the first clip that we're going to show, Navarro lays out the basic defense of this policy, and it's important to understand this defense. And Wallace then challenges him on its likely negative economic consequences. So let's roll the clip.
Steel imports and 10% on aluminum. Joining us now, one of the architects of that controversial plan, White House trade advisor Peter Navarro. Mr. Navarro, welcome to Fox News Sunday.
Mr. Wallace, good to be here, my friend.
The blowback to the new tariff policy is intense, especially from conservatives here are two leading Republican senators.
I hope the president doesn't really do this, because if he does, it's just going to be a huge tax on American citizens.
If you own a steel mill, today was great for you. If you consume steel and every American family at the store tonight bought something that has different metals in it, today's a bad day for you.
Are Sass and Hatch, who is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, are they wrong?
Of course they're wrong. And in terms of the Republican Party, let's remember this. Donald Trump ran against 16 Republicans. None of those Republicans supported Donald Trump's positions on trade. He beat every one of them. And then Donald Trump went on with a Democratic opponent who didn't support his positions on trade, and he beat them too. What Donald Trump wants to do is fulfill his campaign promises to the American people and defend American workers. And when we hear about huge effects here, let's do some of the numbers here. I mean, first of all, the reason why the president is doing this is because if he doesn't do this, we will lose our aluminum industry very quickly, and our steel industry very quickly thereafter. If you look at the aluminum industry, for example, we're down now to less than 10% of fulfilling our demand. We've lost 6 smelters since 2013. We're down to 5 smelters. Only 2 of them are fully operational. We're operating at a 43% capacity factor, and only 1 of those smelters makes the high purity aluminum we need for our defense applications.
Let's unpack some of this. One of the things that both of those senators raised was that this is going to raise prices for American consumers, and the fact is it will. Commerce Secretary Ross estimates that if you take the imported steel that goes into an American-built car, it will increase the price of that car $175. An analyst at the Cato Institute tweeted this: so a new $175 per vehicle tax times 17 million vehicles sold in the USA in 2017 equals almost $3 billion in new annual consumer taxes just for steel and autos. Overall, when you, if I may, sir, if you talk about not just cars, but all the products that use imported steel or imported aluminum, we're talking about a tax on American consumers in the billions of dollars.
I like Secretary Ross's math a whole lot better. Let's do it for aluminum. If you look at a 10% tariff on aluminum, 6-pack of beer or Coke, that's $0.015. If you look at the other end of the spectrum, Boeing 777, it's one of the best airliners ever made. It's a $330 million aircraft. We're talking about an increase in costs at the worst of $25,000. So when you're talking about these massive costs or whatever as a fact, it's not. There are no downstream price effects on our industries that are significant. What we're doing here, and let's be very clear about the mission.
Wait a minute, even if it's $175 a car and there's 17,000 cars, 17 million cars sold, that is a $3 billion tax.
I guess we would disagree about how to do the math here. $175 on a $30,000 car is less, a small fraction of 1%.
You add it up.
To get that, well, you can do that math.
Sir, if you add it up, we're talking billions of dollars in added costs.
And let's see, last time I checked, we had an $18 trillion economy. It's second order small. There's not enough zeros to get
I mean, I know you're a good economist, but the fact is, we're talking in billions of dollars, correct?
On a $19 trillion economy. Look, here.
But you agree, it's a billions of dollars increase in cost.
What I agree is that the downstream effects of steel and aluminum tariffs are insignificant.
All right, so first note how he begins the defense of the tariff policy. Other Republicans are wrong because they lost the election. There isn't really talking about the economic consequences yet in that initial statement. The larger point is that these economic principles of the party are changing. Second, he defends the policy in terms of trying to save the domestic steel and aluminum industries. Right now, domestic aluminum only only makes up about 10% of total domestic demand. So the domestic aluminum industry makes up 10% of total domestic demand. Most of aluminum is purchased from abroad, and what he's talking about is we really need to drive those numbers up. Third, Wallace hammers on the cost to producers associated with these policies, and the discussion of cars is significant, right? They suggest that the tariffs on steel will raise the price of a $30,000 automobile by about $175. Now, this is less than 1%, but it's still significant, and it's a huge chunk of the profit margins of automobile manufacturers as well, right? And Navarro instead wants to emphasize the small 1.5-cent hike on a six-pack of beer. There's a larger point here. Think back to our conversation about society's role in foreign policy making. We talked about how little political power that consumers have in trade policy, and this conversation illustrates that dynamic perfectly. Navarro is effectively saying that there will be a small charge on consumers for this, and because it's so small and because consumers aren't active politically, this is smart politics, because we're not going to see a broad consumer revolt against this policy, and so the political costs of implementing a tariff policy that a lot of people don't like but won't do anything about are low. All right? And think about it this way. Are you going to change your vote in the 2020 presidential election because the cost of your six-pack of beer went up about 2 cents? Probably not, right? So now let's talk about the international political and economic consequences of this policy. We're going to take it in two parts. The first is going to focus on the national security implications, and then we're going to talk about a potential trade war. And we want to begin the national security conversation by returning to the Navarro interview. So let's go ahead and run a second clip.
The mission here is to preserve our steel and aluminum industries for national security and economic security. And look,
all right. I want to pick up on exactly that point, because the president is imposing these new tariffs under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which says that all of this imported steel and all of this imported aluminum, it threatens our national security. I want to ask you about that, though. Here are the countries that we import steel from. Canada is number 1 with 16% of the market. South Korea is number 3. Russia is number 5. And China is way down at number 11 with only 2% of our national steel imports. Question, how can Canadian imports be a threat to our national security when for the last quarter century under law, Canadian imports are the Canadian industrial base is considered part of our defense, the American defense industrial base?
So let's tackle this in two ways. First of all, let's talk about the 232. When 232 investigation, it's national security and economic security broadly defined. And it's country agnostic. It doesn't matter who's sending us this product. The fact is, if we keep receiving it the way we are, we're not going to have an aluminum industry. We're not going to have a steel industry. That aluminum industry, make no mistake here, that thing's on life support. That'll be gone in a year or two if the president doesn't take the courageous actions he's proposed.
So let me ask you, will the president...
Hang on.
No, but let me ask you this. Will the president...
You promised, you asked me not to filibuster. I would ask you to do the same thing.
I'm asking a question. Will the president exempt allies like Canada and Europe?
On Thursday, which was a great meeting with the CEOs, there was uniform consensus that what the president needed to do was tariffs, not quotas, and it needed to be across the board. That was the president's announcement that day. That's the direction it's heading. So my expectation is that's the direction it's heading. And
so in answer to my direct question, will he exempt Canada? Will he exempt the European Union?
That's not his decision. And so,
well, I mean, it is his decision.
Look, you have to understand.
You're saying he's not going to do it.
Understand, Chris. As soon as he starts exempting countries, he has to raise the tariff on everybody else. As soon as he exempts one country, his phone starts ringing from the heads of state of other countries.
So just to make it
why
clear,
not me?
It's a global imposition.
Asked and answered.
All right, a few points here. First, President Trump is going to legally defend his right to impose these tariffs under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. Now, the president has not used this legal justification since the 1970s. This law gives presidents the authority to protect or safeguard industries from international economic competition that produces goods essential for national security. Now, the Commerce Department weighed in, wrote a memo that was published in December saying that President Trump needs to impose these tariffs for national security reasons. The Defense Department weighed in, and we're going to show you the memo that was released a couple weeks ago from Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis on this issue. And notice the slight contradiction in this memo. So first, regarding the December 15, 2017 memo, the DoD believes that the systematic use of unfair trade practices to intentionally erode our innovation and manufacturing industrial base poses a risk to our national security. Note what comes at the end of the paragraph, though. As noted in both Section 232 reports, however, the U.S. military requirements for steel and aluminum each represent only about 3% of U.S. production. Therefore, the DoD does not believe that the findings in these reports impact the ability of DoD programs to acquire the steel or aluminum necessary to meet. So, yeah, we agree with tariffs, but we don't need it for national defense. The other thing, though, that's important here that Mattis points out are the costs and the harm that these tariffs could have on our allies, and it wants exemptions to our allies. And who is the Defense Department talking about? It's talking about Canada, Europe, South Korea, and Japan. These are the principal exporters of steel to the United States. The interesting dynamic in all this is that tariffs are often talked about as a way to punish China for its huge trade deficit with the United States. We get a small proportion of our steel from China. Instead, the costs of this policy are going to come on American allies, Canada, South Korea, Europe. And guess what? Because if they can't sell steel to American markets, they've got to sell that excess steel capacity in international markets where they will be less competitive relative to China. And so actually, this tariff policy might benefit China. This is what Lindsey Graham from South Carolina said. There's also talk about a trade war. What does a trade war look like? This is a progressive game of retaliation in which our trading partners successfully raise tariffs on each other's products. And the net result is to cut international trade, right? So they put tariffs on our orange juice, we put tariffs on their cars. All of this cuts international trade, and it hurts growth in all the countries. The other thing to keep in mind here is that the European response or the Canadian response is going to be politically strategic. They are going to throw retaliatory tariffs on important constituencies inside the United States. Why talking about Harley-Davidsons? Because Harley-Davidsons are made in Paul Ryan's district. Why are they talking about orange juice? Because Florida is strategically important in presidential elections. Why are they talking about bourbon? Bourbon's made in Kentucky. Mitch McConnell. The point is, they are going to select retaliation and they're going to hurt red state areas because that's President Trump's coalition.